Good morning, everyone. I hope you had a nice weekend. So we are continuing our section on Hinduism this week, and there's also a lot of great media content on Hinduism, but we want to make sure that we get a sense of the changes, right, that have happened in the history of the Hindu tradition, right, how it has evolved over time. And so we're marking those by the sacred texts that we're focused on, right? So last week we were talking about the philosophies of the Vedic texts, and then the end of the Vedas, which are known as the Upanishads. And then the text that we're focusing on this week is the Bhagavad Gita, which is actually a small portion of a very, very large epic poem called the Mahabharata. And it's this philosophy that starts to become a little bit more individualistic, right? Last week we were talking about Hindu metaphysics in terms of Brahman and Atman, right? In terms of this unified reality, or at least we were ending on that note, and hopefully you have a sense now of what those are. But in the Bhagavad Gita, we're going to start to see a more personalized relationship with the divine as a potential path to enlightenment, right? But the idea is that in Hinduism, there is no one answer for everyone, and that's going to be tied specifically to the caste system, right? That in addition to, your previous karma being able to, place you in a particular spot or realm to be reborn, that will also correlate to which caste you're in, which will correlate to both your current status as well as your spiritual potential moving forward, right? And so all of this is going to be more and more made more concrete in the institutionalized religion as it progresses. So some interesting things to note there, as well as I think just the story of the Bhagavad Gita is really interesting. We can talk through, it's if you're into sci-fi, like time freezes, and it's an individual having a conversation with what he thought was another human and turns out to be one of the Hindu gods incarnated. And so that's really fun. So let's review our introduction to Hinduism last week, because there are tons of terms that we need to be familiar with. So remember, we're dealing with metaphysics primarily at this point, right? Getting a sense of the nature of reality, right? That model of reality within these traditions. And that metaphysical picture then has implications on their epistemology, right? What sort of knowledge is possible and how we get it is, of course, going to be relative to what is real and what's not. And then, of course, on to axiology, values and ethics, and how we ought to live, right? What we should be doing. So in that sense, right, we are focusing on a monistic metaphysics. So who can remind us what monism is as a metaphysical view? Yes, the oneness of everything, okay? So the idea that things are separate in distinct entities, right? That, I exist independently of my cat, like that, according to a monistic metaphysics, is illusory, right? Those distinctions are not real, right? Real in the most real sense that we talked about last week, right? Real as in, if I make a statement that is true, it will always be true, right? And the reason for that, again, is because there is a facet of the physical world that makes it less real than, say, more abstract truths. Who can remember what is the feature of the physical world that makes it illusory in Hinduism? Good, it's temporality, Joseph, right? So everything in the physical world is temporary. So is then anything I say about the physical world, right? Any statement I say about myself might be little t true now, but it's not big capital T truth, because at one point it wasn't true, say before I existed, and then at one point in the future it will no longer be true, because I am temporary, right? So anything said about me is also temporary, or its truthfulness, right, is temporarily determined. Okay, so that oneness of everything, right, that's the most real thing. And so in Hinduism, what is that ultimate reality called? The most real thing in Hinduism? Brahman, very good. Now we're going to see a couple of variations of this word. So Brahman is the ultimate reality. We're also going to see, I'm forgetting, sometimes they even spell it the same. There's Brahma, which is one of the three main personalities or ways of depicting Brahman, right? So there's Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. Those are called the Trimurti, right? And that is a way in which we can conceive of Brahman, because it's really hard for the brain to conceptualize infinite everythingness, right? And so what we end up getting in Hinduism is both monism and also polytheism, right? And we end up getting this whole pantheon of gods. In some cases, there have been identified as over 33 million different Hindu gods. So again, that sounds very polytheistic, right? So many gods. But in reality, again, those are just names, faces, personalities, aspects of the one ultimate reality of Brahman, right? And so the three primary attributes again are the Trimurti. So that's Brahma, Shiva, and Vishnu. Anyone remember what specific personalities these each represent? You can remember what Brahma is, what is Shiva, what is Vishnu, what do they represent? Characteristics. Good, Shiva, destruction and recreation. Excellent, right? So Shiva's the destroyer, but also very importantly, Joseph, the creator, right? The recreator. Very good. So Shiva's both in charge of destruction and recreation. Brahma is the initial creation. Okay, so there's Brahma, the initial creation, Shiva, the destruction and recreation. And then who can remember what Vishnu is? There's creation, destruction, and recreation. Yeah, basically the sustaining force, right? Where we're not being created or destroyed. Yeah, the in-between. Good. So Vishnu is the sustainer of life, right? And so these are, I think, primarily ways of describing the facets of samsara, right? The way Brahma works in samsara. So, right, we have these primary attributes of Brahman, right? The ultimate reality. We can talk about Brahman in these different ways. So what's very interesting in the Bhagavad Gita then is the specific name of the god that is incarnated in a person. And specifically it's Vishnu, right? So in the story of the Bhagavad Gita, right, we have a warrior whose name is Arjuna, and he is archer. Thank you. I was going to say boner. An archer, but he's on the back of a chariot. So there's the chariot driver, the charioteer, right, whose name is Krishna. And so the Arjuna, the archer on the back of the chariot, is about to go into battle, and he's supposed to fight what are actually his relatives, his cousins. And in the story, they represent evil, and his side of the family represents good, and it has to do with the way they treated slaves, right? So it's a very morally weighty story, right? It's life and death, right? Very high stakes. And Arjuna is having a moral dilemma. He is struggling with what he sees as his conflicting duties, because one of the important elements in being able to achieve moksha, nirvana is in Buddhism, moksha, which is enlightenment, being able to be released from samsara and reabsorbed into Brahman. The idea is that in order to achieve that, you have to fulfill your duty. So you have to figure out what your duty is. And again, that's going to be tied to which caste you're in. So because Arjuna is a warrior, right, his duty is to go kill the bad guys. But he also has just a general human duty to not kill his relatives, right, and to not kill members of his family. So he's really struggling with this moral dilemma. And so time comes to a standstill, and he starts having a conversation with the only other person who's not frozen in time, which is his chariot driver, Krishna. And it turns out that Krishna is the incarnation of Vishnu. So what do you think it means that at this moment of moral conflict, it is Vishnu, not Brahma, not Shiva, but Vishnu, who comes down and takes human form? What might that mean? That's what it would seem, right? Like, so, right, if we have creation and destruction and recreation, well, those seem to be like pretty in line with war and fighting. the before and the after and such. So if it's Vishnu instead, it must be to keep things sustained, right? To sustain life. But does anyone know what advice does Krishna give Arjuna? What advice does Vishnu give to this human? What does he tell him to do? Does he tell him to fight or not fight? So Joseph says no. Seems very consistent thing for Vishnu to do. Any other guesses? Vishnu actually tells him to fight. How do we make sense of that? Why could it possibly make sense? The lead to less loss is good. So there's the karmic element, right, which is important. The idea that they're representing this evil side, right? It's not like this situation has come about, as a first option, right? They've tried to reason with these people in the past, right? So this is just the consequence to their actions, right? It's the karmic consequences to their actions that he happens to be a part of, right? So by fulfilling his duty as a warrior and by protecting the good against the evil, you are in fact, right? You could make like a utilitarian calculus here, right? Sacrificing the few for the good of the many and something like that. Any other ideas? Let's focus back to the temporality of Maya. If Arjuna is really worried about killing his family members, what's he not getting? What's he not seeing clearly? Is this who we are, this life right now? Is that all we are in Hinduism? Is it so important, this life? More than just family. Think back to last week. Is there any part of us that will live on? How do we continue in Hinduism, in Hindu metaphysics? Atman, good, right? You have an immortal soul. You have a true self. Okay, so if Arjuna is just, all beat up about him being good and them being evil, or him being their family and a warrior and having to do these things, he's caught up in Maya. He is caught up in the illusion that these things are separate and that, you're doing this to somebody else. Like, he's missing the cohesiveness, right? He's missing the fact that whoever you're identifying as your cousins or whatever in this case, that's not them. They have a true self, and that true self is the same as your true self, right? We all share the same true self. The idea is that it's just temporarily been broken up, right? And we need to overcome this illusion that we're all separate and recognize the connectivity of it, right? So you're not really killing anybody, right? You're ending the biological lifespan of that physical form, but you can't kill, right? That literally is impossible. If you think that who you are is tied to your immortal soul, right? Then it can't be killed like that, right? So the idea is that him being caught up in this dilemma is really just a sign that he is still suffering from the illusion of Maya, right? That illusion, that ignorance of the true self has a word. It's called avidya. So the thing that keeps us trapped in the cycle of samsara, regardless of our karma, is our avidya, our ignorance of our true self, right? Our Atman, that part of us that is one with Brahman. Right, so I mentioned that I was going to use a puzzle metaphor. I also have a coat rack metaphor, if that works for you too. But so again, I want us to imagine Brahman, the ultimate reality, as like an infinite puzzle piece, or an infinite puzzle with infinite pieces. Okay, that's Brahman. That's ultimate reality. That's everything. Okay. What we see, right, is just, of course, a small part of that reality. And that, because we see everything as broken up into little pieces, we think, oh, that's real. That's Maya. That's the physical world, right? But again, that's the illusion, is we don't see how everything is connected. And so, right, thinking that everything is disparate and that, we're out for ourselves, or it's a choice between us and others, all of that is part of that avidya. And so to overcome it, we have to understand that our true self is shared, right, in that monistic, holistic way. And the way you go about doing that is going to be different depending on which caste you're in. So that's why we have at least 4 different paths to enlightenment, or moksha. Okay? And so the path that is right for you will depend on which caste you're in, right? So this is also correlated to your soul. There are said to be 3 different gunas, or forces, ruling over your soul. And this is tied. It's very analogous to what you see if you're familiar with Plato's tripartite soul in Greek philosophy. They're very similar or analogous three forces. So we have the appetitive part of us, which is the part that gives us biological life. This is what we share with plants and animals. We have the spirited part of us, which is our hunger and drive. We share that with animals, but most people don't think plants have that. And then, of course, the part that is unique only to humans, which is the rational part. Okay? And so like any living thing, right, we have these to various degrees. And again, this in the Hindu metaphysical picture is going to be somehow correlated to your karma. So there's going to be a hierarchy of these gunas. Which ones do we think are going to be the most valuable? Which guna? Spirited, the appetitive, the rational, which is most important? Yeah, you want to say spirited, but you think it's rational. Yeah, you are correct, Joseph, right? Rational, because that is the thing that's supposedly separates humans, right, from all other living things, right? It's the thing that makes us special. And so in Vedic Hindu philosophy, it said that that is where your personal identity resides, with the rational part of the soul. Okay, and so that is the thing that you only, get to really manifest when you're born as a human. And that's why it's so important to cultivate ethics, right, when born in human form. And so these are going to be ranked, and you're going to see that they correlate to different elements of the caste system, right? So the higher up the caste you go, you'll see that the types of jobs required of you are more intellectual jobs, right? Whereas the lower in the caste you go, down towards, right, just physical brute strength, right? Then we're talking about the warriors, to just the drive of, say, economic business, to just people who are basically just considered slaves, right? And they're good for physical labor, right? They just have the bodies. And so all of that is going to be correlated, again, saying not just something about your past, but also potentially saying something about your future, which is why these philosophies are so meaningful, right? Because they not only give us a story of how things came to be, how they came about, why they are the way they are now, which then has implications on how we think they ought to be going forward, right? So once we start to build up this metaphysical picture and we start to get down to how it affects us as individual humans, we start to see that the impacts are quite significant, right? If any of you are familiar with the effects of colonialism in India, especially, right, you'll be aware of the way the caste system still continues to this day to affect people's quality of life, right? It affects how much money you can make, right? What parts of society are available to you and things like this. So it's really important to understand the foundation of where these ideas come from. And the gunas really show up in the Bhagavad Gita, right? There's lots of discussion of how those work, and how you can tell, right, which guna is ruling over someone's soul, so to speak. All right, so questions so far. A lot of terms, mostly review, hopefully. Questions about this metaphysical picture. All right, so even though everything is part of one monistic whole, right, there is a sense in which we can talk about two parts of reality then, right? So we have Brahman, the ultimate reality, and then we have Maya, the illusory part, right? But they really are, again, part of one unified whole. And so this is sometimes the tricky thing about understanding monistic metaphysics, is that they still have to make sense, right, of the way that our minds need to segregate things to understand them and categorize them, while still trying to maintain that conceptual unity. Okay, and so that's what they're going to be doing, and that's what we're going to see is going to be distinct from a more monistic metaphysics in Buddhism, right? Because even though Hinduism is monistic in that it's all part of Brahman, Buddhism doesn't even have Brahman, right? So they have really just focused on Maya, right, and that physical part. And so it's an even more simplistic metaphysical picture coming up. So I want to make sure we have a handle on this more complex picture ahead of time. So one of the other important things about the Bhagavad Gita is the metaphor of the chariot, right? So the metaphor of the chariot is meant to represent the relationship of our souls to our physical bodies and the world in a way that explains why we suffer from avidya. So I'm going to try to pull up the chariot. Okay, so I'm sharing an image there with everyone in the chat. I mean, there's lots of versions on this online that you could look up, right? I'm sure some of the graphics are better than others. But basically the idea is, again, this is a representation to show you that the most real parts of you even are not tied to your physical self, right? So this question of personal identity ends up becoming really important, right? What makes you you over time? Well, it is your Atman, your soul, but we obviously think our souls are different, right? So why is it that we think that? And this metaphor is supposed to give us a reason for that. It's because your soul is wandering around Maya in this body. And so it's, of course, going to interpret everything about the world through that body, right? And through the context of that body. So looking at this image, right, if you can all pull it up for yourself, right? We have the horses in the front, okay? And these are obviously representing your senses, right? Your sense experience. That's literally the thing taking you through the world, right? And then, of course, the road that they encounter is going to be any objects that your senses encounter, right? So this, of course, is going to differ. Like some of our horses might not be the same. What do you think I mean by that? If I'm using this metaphor of the chariot, I say some of our horses aren't the same. Yeah, our senses are different. Yes, exactly. Not just, I mean, interests, yes, like sometimes we can control that, but in also ways that we can't control. Like I'm sure some of you have much better eyesight than I do. Some of you also wear glasses. So some of you might have worse eyesight than me, right? Some people have like a really good sense of smell or really terrible hearing, right? Or really exceptional, right? So we all have, yes, we've got the same senses, but again, of course, they're going to be different. And so the way we experience Maya is going to be different as well, right? The way that we encounter that external world. Now then, after the horses, right, who's steering the horses in this metaphor? The intellect, right? So do you think that's true? Is your mind holding the reins of your sense experience? It's using it exactly like an instrument. Good, right? That's sort of what they're saying, right? So there's this really interesting way in which we're formulating a sense of yourself, right? Your I, your ego, right? But you're doing it in a way that's separating yourself from the physical body that you happen to inhabit, right? And that's what this metaphor is getting at, right? Breaking apart the parts that make up our sensation of who we are, but stripping away the things that aren't permanent, right? Taking away the temporality of those things and trying to get to the most foundational part, which is hopefully, right, something that is permanent. Good. So we have the mind, the intellect, which is going to be, right, so you have the brain, and then, so that's like the muscle that's holding the reins, and then you have the driver, right, potentially making those decisions. Okay, so then after the driver, we have Arjuna, who is underneath this veil, right? So the veil or filters are the schools of thought. But the idea is that, again, your true self, you can uncover yourself from this veil of ignorance, right? And uncover your true self underneath. And then the physical chariot that he's in is just your physical body, right? It's just carrying that true self around. Again, I don't know how helpful certain visuals are to you all, so I'm going to use the ones that are helpful to me. But do any of you all remember like the first Men in Black movie? Yes, okay, good. And one of the aliens is actually like one of those tiny little green alien guys, and he's operating a human robot, right? Like it opens up and he's inside. Again, right, the physical soul is not meant to be like a physical thing that takes up space, but that's sort of how they're talking about it, right? It's like it's somehow interacting with your physical body and using it to interact with the world. And I think that's how a lot of people understand the soul to be, right? That's something that can be separated from the physical body. Now, it's important to note that that's not always the case. So it's actually in Abrahamic religions, the physical body that you're in is very much a part of your personal identity, right? There's no reincarnation. So what you look like is very much connected to who you are. But in metaphysics that have reincarnation, this is just one of many bodies, right, that you will have. It's not a part of your true self, right? That part of you that is permanent. And since none of those parts of you are permanent, right? The idea is that in order to achieve enlightenment, to get to some sort of truth, you can only tap into that truth through the most true part of yourself. Saw it in theaters. Oh man, that must have been forever ago. All right. So what's then interesting are the ways in which the different paths are meant to work. Okay, so again, it's nice, it's inclusive for everybody, right? There's a path no matter what caste you're in, but also it's not super inclusive in that it's going to set you on a path, and there's no moving up the social ladder, as you will, right? You are stuck in the caste that you're in. In very traditional families, even Hindu families today, parents might not even let you marry someone in a different caste than the rest of your family, right? So very, very strict segregation in those respects. What's especially fascinating though, and I know this isn't a gender class, but it's always worth mentioning, is that gender is very much tied to your karma in the Hindu philosophy. And so very much tied to what caste you are in. So though castes are families, right? So women can literally, in fact, being born into any caste, the fact that one is born into a female body in the Hindu religion is itself a sign that you have accumulated bad karma. The female physical form is associated with not rationality, not the intellect, but the least important guna, according to humanity, the biology, right? So it's super problematic. It means that if you are a single woman, you are considered to be the lowest caste. Just by virtue of being a woman, you are the lowest caste, but it's only through your family, through the male members of your family, that you're able to access any sort of privilege from any other level of the caste system. So very, very significant, right? But again, says something about how one is meant to approach the path to enlightenment. So the idea is that if you are lower in the caste, right, it's going to involve more physical activities. So this is where you get more of the bhakti yogas that are about movement and labor. And it's not so much what you do, but who you're doing it for, right? So that the fruits of your labor are never for yourself, right? They're always for God, right? Or for the purposes of, right, communal harmony or something like this, right? It's bigger than oneself, not a selfish, egotistical aim. Whereas those higher up the caste are going to have more intellectual pursuits. The idea is that they're going to have to probably do study and more serious intellectual work to achieve enlightenment. And then there's even going to be views, and again, this ends up getting developed a little bit more in Buddhism, but about like how, there's going to be ways to tell like how close you are to achieving moksha, right? So it's like, actually, now it's sort of reminding me of Scientology, like you move up the ladder, right, to going clear. You move up the caste in different lifetimes, right, until you achieve, until you achieve enlightenment. But they don't actually have a vertical ladder system like the Scientologists do. But similar idea, right, that the movement happens over many lifetimes, though. Right. Okay, so again, I don't want to just reiterate everything that is in the recordings, so let's have questions. Questions about Hindu metaphysics, about any of those terms, about reincarnation, about karma. Yeah, so here is, Joseph, go for it. Yes, good. So this has to do with a debate in philosophy between what's called materialism and immaterialism, right? So this is another way of talking about dualistic metaphysics, right? So dualistic metaphysics typically holds that there are two types of things: physical stuff and then non-physical stuff, right? And so in Hinduism, right, there is physical stuff, but it's just not real. But so the idea here is that the mind is going to be your physical brain matter, right? But that, because it's physical brain tissue, it will decompose like everything else, right, with your physical body. So it's what is in control of, it's holding the reins, the physical brain matter, because it's the physical part of you that's connected to your nerves, which allows you to have sense experience, right? So what's the gap in the philosophy has to be between the mind and the intellect, right? So the mind is the physical brain, and then the intellect ends up being that rational part of the soul. But, it's still a question of like, what is that? And, it really just ends up being in philosophy understood as like the thinking part of you. And if you think that the thinking part of you can all be explained by the brain, then you're just a materialist. You just only think there's material things. We don't need that extra, immaterial explanation for what's going on. So if you think that once the brain disintegrates, that there's no rationality left to exist, right? That would be a materialist response. But if you think that there is some sort of immaterial rational component, again, most people tie it then to the soul, right? But it's still, we have to explain how the soul interacts with the body. That's a really difficult conversation, but that's where we get these types of metaphors, right? This is supposed to be something about some sort of visual representation of how they interact with each other. Plato again talked about it like an instrument, like an artist and their tool, right? We are the artists, not the tools that we use to make the art, sort of a thing. And so the brain is even just a tool in this case. Other questions so far? All right, so I shared a link to the caste system infographic, right? So there you have on the left-hand side, right, the different castes. So that will tell you like what family or what socioeconomic status you're born into. Then in the middle, you sort of get a description of the jobs or what exactly those parts of society mean in terms of, your function or your duties in this case, right? If you're trying to achieve moksha, right? The idea is that this is what you should aim to do, right? This is what role fits you into society best. And then, of course, that is determined by the thing on the far right, the force ruling over your soul, right? So the stuff on the right is a justification for, right, you being in that particular role. It's because, right, the idea that you're born into that caste means that this part of the soul is ruling over you. But of course, we can already see it ways in which that's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So if I come from a wealthy family and have access to education, right, it's going to be a lot easier for me to say that uneducated, poor people who don't have access to that, right, only deserve to be in menial labor, right? I could just be keeping the cycle going. So again, there are issues of justice and fairness, right, that need to be questioned, especially if we're supposed to take this notion of our Atman and oneness seriously, right? If we are really trying to get over our Avidya, what's with all these separations, right? Why are we classifying people more and more? So again, it's going to be important that this sort of caste system comes later in the tradition, right? And not so much from earlier on, at least in terms of us trying to make sense of potential problems, right, that we might encounter. Yeah, so I think those are the main things. We are at 11:40. And again, unfortunately, they're not going to let me hold class on Thursday. But the other important thing to note, in addition to the historical timeline, are again the ways in which it has evolved since then. So I'm just taking a screenshot for you here of the bits on my website, the infographics there, and I'll share that link again. Hopefully it works for you guys today. But the one on the left is that timeline, right? So those sacred texts, you can get a sense of, the chronological order of them. And then afterwards, we see this huge, intellectual boon, lots of different branches of Hinduism breaking off and forming different philosophies. Now, that's going to be important for us because Buddhism is going to be one of the many schools that comes out of the Hindu tradition, right? Which is why we're going to see so much overlap, but also such important differences, right? So focusing again on how it's going to be more monistic, focusing just on Maya, right? Sort of highlighting this potential dualistic element of the previous Hindu schools where they were really talking about two different things, even though they were trying to create this monistic picture. There's a true reality and then there's the illusion, right? The physical stuff, and explaining the interaction between that. So yeah, lots of information there. Take a look. These are great overviews. And yeah, Joseph, we can definitely talk about your paper. Riley, you have anything I can help you with? Maybe he stepped away. Oh, not that you can think of. Okay, cool. All right, Joseph, what's up? So there's a way in which you can frame it as a whether or not, and then say neither, right?
Yeah.
Which I think would probably just be the simplest, just in terms of making it coincide with the instructions. But otherwise we could like work on some fancy grammar. But I would just say that, just do the question so that it's not super convoluted, right? Simple topic, whether or not, and then your position is that it's both or neither.